LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. He was the 36th President of the United States, and as one, did great things. He was one of the few presidents to do things that affect us today. There are basically two things that you should know about Lyndon Johnson. He was a tryhard. He did as much as he could to help both the nation and his people. When he tried, he was able to pass many documents and acts. As president, one of his main objectives was to help the impoverished. Lyndon Johnson was able to make an economy with an unemployment rate of 22% down to 13%, one of the greatest reductions in U.S. history. In order to do this, he was able to pass many acts and convince the public to join his fight. This battle was called the War on Poverty. This includes several reformatory legislations, the Social Security Act and Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. The second part that Lyndon Johnson wanted to address was the Great Society. The Great Society was a set of domestic programs in the United States announced by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The War on Poverty was part of the Great Society, but it was so important we decided to make it into a different part. The Great Society also endorsed environmental reform, civil rights, and education. Johnson was very influential in protecting the environment. He created many programs that protected untouched resources. He also made extensions to previous environmental laws and was convinced that we should not only protect the environment, but heal the damage we have done to it. One of the acts he was able to pass was the Environmental Wilderness Act. This preserved many areas in the United States.
The National Geographic calls Lyndon Johnson the nation's greatest environmental president.
I think Lady Bird Johnson was one of the great first ladies in American history. She was the environmental first lady, and in many ways there was a co-presidency about keeping America beautiful and clean. Seminal was the Wilderness Act of 1964, which preserved large patches of wild America. There's also the Clean Air, Clean River, Clean Waters Act.
Of all the reckless devastations of our national heritage, none is really more shameful than the continued poisoning of our rivers and our air.
He said that every administration has to have an environmental record. And since Johnson, we're all trying to match what he was able to accomplish in that regard.
As wilderness shrank, the movement to protect it grew. And in the end, America did something no other country had ever done. It passed a law to protect its last remnants of wild land forever. The Wilderness Act of 1964
Another very important part of the Great Society, and one of its most lasting in its result, is civil rights. As president, he made the first civil rights legislations since Reconstruction. One act that he was able to pass and is related to civil rights is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 enforces the right to vote, provides relief against discrimination, prohibits job discrimination, and stops funds of programs that would support discrimination.
In 1964, Johnson and the civil rights groups managed to pass the first major civil rights legislation.
And it was the first comprehensive civil rights legislation in the United States since 1875.
The Civil Rights Act said public accommodations have to be available to everybody, no discrimination on the basis of race. So with one fell swoop, the Great Society wiped out all the whites-only signs.
Communities that were segregated by race or by religion were originally started because people were not necessarily welcome in other communities. And the diversity of Vienna now, as is reflected in our classrooms every day, I think shows that the Civil Rights Act of '64 did its best to level the playing field, to take away all the unfairness that existed in society. And I know job applications talk about you may not be denied employment based on race or religion, national origin, etc., and that's all part of the Civil Rights Act of '64.
Another act that is related to civil rights is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act was very important because it guarantees the right to vote through prohibiting literacy tests and poll taxes. As a result, African Americans are able to vote with greater ease. 250,000 blacks were able to register to vote. This was a momentous step in civil rights because it minimizes the disenfranchisement of blacks.
In 1965, the president proposed the Voting Rights Act.
The assumption was that everybody could vote, but everybody being able to vote did not mean that everybody's vote was counted or even accepted.
Because until that Voting Rights Act, there were all sorts of restrictions on black voting across the South, be it poll taxes or be it literacy tests.
This ended discrimination in voting, opened up voting to all Americans.
Civil rights became such an issue, and it was gaining support not just in the black community, but in a large segment of the white community, that it couldn't be ignored any longer.
In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed Congress into enacting legislation concerning voting rights.
He felt like it was the president's job to spearhead a betterment of society, and he felt like denying a large segment of the population precious rights like the right to vote was unacceptable.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave the federal government power to regulate state voting issues and laws. This has given African Americans and other minorities an opportunity to partake in American democracy.
I think he would tell you the Voting Rights Act was the most important and the most significant because he knew that if every citizen had the opportunity to participate in the political process, the other benefits would flow.
Another major legislation passed for the Great Society is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as the SEA. This funded primary and secondary education but did not form a national curriculum. This act also emphasized equal access to education and established high standards and accountability. The goal of this act was to make opportunities fair and equal for students. The funds from this act was put into learning materials, professional development, and educational programs.
The whole concept of those programs was that the decision ought to be based on whether you had the ability to excel, not whether your daddy had a big, thick wallet. And then Head Start.
Head Start was a program to allow impoverished children to begin educational training.
When they get a chance to go to school earlier, the assumption is that the next level of education is going to improve.
Title I of the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as Improving the Academic Achievement of the Disadvantaged, is the largest and one of the nation's oldest federally funded education programs. It provides additional funds to local school districts to assist low-achieving students in high-poverty schools. Title I funds must be used to provide services that are supplemental or in addition to services normally provided by the school district. Funds are used to help all students meet the state's challenging academic standards. In a targeted assistance program, a school uses Title I funds to provide individual students with the greatest academic need with extra educational assistance beyond the regular classroom. Services are supplemental or in addition to services normally provided by the school district for participating children. These services can include pull-out, in-class, extended day, or extended year summer programs.
To help fight the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson and Congress passed the Social Security Act of 1965. This act established and founded Medicare and Medicaid. These programs provided health insurance for the elderly and the poor. It was funded by a tax on the earnings of employees, matched by contributions by employers. In the first 3 years of the program, nearly 20 million people enrolled in it.
In the 60s, there was no health care coverage provided by corporations.
People who reached the age of 65 did not have guaranteed health insurance. And of course, Medicare now has tens of millions of people in it. It is one of the most popular social programs in the country's history, and it seems like a humane and generous act of the society.
Hi, I'm Zach Toombs for About.com, and we're talking about Medicare. Created as part of the Social Security Act of 1965, Medicare was established as a means to ensure elderly American citizens had available health insurance. Prior to its passage in 1965, many seniors were either unable to obtain health insurance or were unable to afford the high premiums. The creation of Medicare resulted in the expansion of emergency rooms and doctors' offices due to a critical component. For doctors and hospitals to be eligible to receive federal Medicare funds, their practices had to be desegregated. Medicare ranks alongside Social Security as being one of the main government social programs to aid the elderly and provide a safety net against high medical costs associated with old age. In 2010, the federal government spent $523 billion on Medicare expenses.
The Economic Opportunity Act was central to Johnson's Great Society campaign and its war on poverty. The act included social programs to promote health, education, and general welfare of the impoverished. These programs include Head Start and the Job Corps. The purpose of this act was to eliminate poverty, expand educational opportunities, increase the safety net for the poor and unemployed, and tend to health and financial needs of the elderly.
People who are suffering. It's hard for us to remember those people. Lyndon never really forgot them, I think. I really think he never did.
His vision was of helping the disadvantaged to help themselves. His hope was that you give them education, you give them opportunity, you give them the chance to come into the mainstream of American middle-class economic life. And that's as thoroughly American as apple pie.
I remember coming home one day, actually it was the first day of kindergarten, and telling my mom, everybody loves me. And you know, she was just so enthused. And I really think it's attributable to my experience with Head Start, because it helped to build the confidence so that when I did start school, I was ready and able to learn and able to work with other children.
They keep coming all day. 350 youngsters with one thing in common: the opening of the Rodman Job Corps Center at New Bedford, Massachusetts.
The Job Corps was part of the war on poverty. At the time, there were hundreds of thousands of men and women with no real job opportunities.
Johnson wants this Job Corps as a place people can train, come away with skills.
This was legislation that was offering work to young men and women, and I think it's been pretty successful.
It's taught me and several people that I've known that have gone out there a lot of independence.
A lot of kids in the inner city are great. They have great talents, but they don't know how to bring it out of themselves. And that's one thing Job Corps does. It brings the good out of people.